Well, hello there. Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools, and on today's episode, we are installing this amazing shingle roof on this massive carport. If you want to learn how to do it, keep on watching. Let's get started.
In our last video, I showed the entire process of how we actually got to this point, whether it was drilling and pouring concrete footers, all the framing that went into our carport, along with all the sheathing on top. And yes, for all of those wondering how much this entire build cost, a full cost breakdown will be provided at the tail end of this video. But till then, let's get to the roof.
Now that we have all of our plywood in place, it's now time to waterproof properly. This is a roofing membrane that's gonna go around the perimeter, and I'm gonna be a little extra careful. This is a low profile roof line in terms of the slope, as well as the fact that we're in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle and it rains. So I'm gonna actually apply a layer of this first before I even get to my trim flashing.
Flashing tape might not be the pinnacle of entertainment, but it's extremely important when it comes to protecting everything that's underneath it because so much work and energy went into the framing portion of this project, and we want to make sure it's properly protected for decades to come. One thing to keep in mind on any roofing or a siding project is to make sure you have proper lapping. That means that the very bottom lip is going to be applied first with our flashing tape, and then the sides are going to overlap that bottom corner, and we're going to run our flashing tape all the way up. Both sides will be completely flashed before we even get to the top, and think of it with gravity purposes because the lower elevation side is always going to be applied first, then move your way up as the elevation increases. Also note that there's different widths available in this flashing tape, but I generally suggest that you go with a 5 or 6 inch wide flashing tape, so there's plenty on top of your sheathing, but there's also plenty to go over the edge onto your rough framing. With all 4 sides sealed, we can now move on to our flashing trim. An F-style metal drip edge is applied to the very back side of our carport, and a normal L-shaped drip edge is going to be applied to both sides of our carport. I first go about tacking our F-style drip edge in first with galvanized nails, and that's with my metal connection framing nailer. Now you can obviously use a roofing nailer in this application, but I find this connection framing nailer works just fine as well. This trim only came in 10-foot lengths, so I had to overlap these seams, but at every location where I have to overlap, I do apply some Henry's sealant, which is specifically used in roofing applications. At any point in time, if you do have to cut this metal flashing, I just take some metal cutting snips and snip the flashing down as needed. With our backside drip edge in place and sealed properly, we can move on to more flashing tape. I do apply another layer of flashing tape right over all of those nails so I can guarantee even further waterproofing protection. This is something I generally recommend on any roofing project, but especially on low sloped roofing projects like this. We can now move on to our roofing underlayment, and for this project we're going to be going with our Pro Armor Synthetic Roofing Underlayment by Owens Corning. Now there are plenty of roofing underlayments out there and you can pick which one you prefer the most, but the one thing you keep in mind is you want to make sure you have one that accounts for low sloped roofs, and this one specifically does, but the layering process is different than what you would normally see on a higher sloped roof. Number 1 being the first coarse row of your roofing underlayment is actually cut in half because we're going to be applying a second layer right over the top of this first layer. Both these layers overhang the flashing tape that we previously installed, but it doesn't overhang our metal drip edge, and I hold that back approximately 1.5 inches from the very front of the lip. As for holding our underlayment in place, nails with large plastic round caps are preferred, but that's mainly preferred if you are going to be applying your underlayment and leaving it uncovered for days, weeks, or even months. If you're going to be installing shingles that very day or even that week, then staples in a staple gun will work perfectly well as long as you're not in some super high wind area. Again, due to the low profile of this roof, our overlapping between each layer of our underlayment is quite significant, and we're basically going to be doing half sheet overlaps or at least a quarter sheet overlap in this circumstance. While I was getting the underlayment in, I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that the homeowner wanted to help out today and bring up some of these asphalt shingles. So I took her up on it, and it was a lot easier for me to position all these roof shingles into position on the underlayment while still being focused on getting the underlayment installed. As we work our way up the roof, this is a good time to note that there are now tripping hazards on our roof, so be careful and note where you are walking and standing on this roof in comparison to where the edge of your roof line is. As mentioned previously, this is a very low sloped roof, so I do feel very comfortable walking around without any fall protection, but be mindful of your own abilities and comfort levels, especially on hot days, and stay hydrated in that case, because I personally find that when I make physical mistakes where it could actually hinder and hurt myself, it's normally because I'm trying to speed through the process of doing something, or I'm overheated and dehydrated, which is easy to do on a roof. But now that our underlayment is fully installed, we can get to more flashing. Yep, we're not quite to asphalt shingles yet, because we still need to do some waterproofing and flashing before we get to that point. I proceed to cut any excess or unnecessary underlayment first, and then start installing our drip edge flashing on each side. This is L-shaped metal flashing and is installed just as I did similarly to the very front edge. The only thing is it might look a little roughed up because I may have made a mistake and installed this before I installed the underlayment the very first time. That was my mistake. I did a little bit more research and realized, oh, of course, yes, this needs to be applied after I install the underlayment, so I did remove it and then reinstalled it after our underlayment was installed properly. If you're wondering why that's a big deal, just remember that it's all about the proper layering process, and this is the proper application for a roof structure like this. With our metal flashing on both sides and nailed down, we can move on to more flashing tape being applied right on top of that seam between our underlayment and our metal flashing. With both sides flashed properly, we can move on to the very top seam and apply one final layer of flashing tape at this location before we can move finally on to asphalt shingles.
For this project, we're going to be going with Owens Corning Asphalt Shingles. Now, this is a great, trusted product to use, but it also matches perfectly the existing roof that's on the house. And that's exactly what I wanted on this particular project, because why have multiple different colors of roofing if you can match them all together? Let's bust them open and start out on our shingles.
This particular shingle is from the True Definition Duration series, and the color is Sierra Gray. We start out by cutting a number of them perfectly in half, following that seam on the very back side, and once we have a nice stack of those going, we can make our way up to the top of our roof and start installing our starter strip. Prior to installing the starter strip, I do take the height dimension of our shingles and burn a 1/4 to 1/2 inch off of that measurement. That means our shingles will be slightly overhanging our drip edge, which is exactly what we want. I snap a chalk line, and we are now finally ready to start installing some roofing nails. I'm using a pneumatic coil nailer, which will make quick work of installing all these shingles, but the problem is that there's a lot of them, so we better get to work. The starter strip actually starts by cutting off 6.5 inches off of one side, and this will be the very first piece that we install, and that's due to the fact that we don't want our seams to line up during the installation process. I immediately start nailing off this first piece and make my way down the entire length of our roof. As I make my way to the very end of this first row of starter strip, you are most likely going to have to cut off any excess on your project, and on this one, I certainly did, which was easy enough to do with a fresh utility blade. And I certainly suggest having plenty of utility blades on hand, because these things get worn down quite quickly with asphalt shingles. As I lay my very first full piece of asphalt shingles, I'm basically just lining up the back side of the shingle with my chalk line that I previously applied to the roof. I then immediately line up the asphalt shingle right next to it and nail that one down with the proper nailing pattern. Now, if I say proper nailing pattern, it means that you want to leave approximately 1 inch of space from edge to edge, and then space out approximately 12 inches from the side nails to the interior nails. And please keep in mind that this specific nail pattern is for full sheets of shingles. With one full row in, we can move on to our second row, but in order to have the best and most consistent look possible across this entire roof, I do decide to take my string line and string off the remaining rows, at least in this first section. From the back side of the first row of shingle, I'm measuring 5 5/8 of an inch, and with the string line, I then line up those marks accordingly and snap a line. Prior to installing our second row of shingles, you do have to cut off 6.5 inches off of whichever side is going to be hanging off of the carport edge. And once cut, laid, and nailed, you can install that entire row of shingles, or you can move on to the next row. Now the next row you're going to be cutting 13 inches off because you're taking 6.5 inches, timesing it by 2, and cutting that off for your third row. You basically do this over and over again through 6 full courses. The number 1 course is the full piece of shingles, then 6.5 inches are marked off, 13 inches are cut off, 19.5 inches are cut off, 26 inches are cut off, and then finally 32.5 inches are cut off on the final row. Then you go back up to a full sheet. But before we can even get to another row, I lay down a few more chalk lines and start installing full sheets across all the other rows that we previously installed. With our cut to size starter courses already done on our left side, this area is a complete breeze in comparison and is really a lot more satisfying than trying to cut each individual one. Speaking of cutting these sections, I got a quick tip for you.
So it took me a little while to figure this out, but it is much easier and much better to just have a nice workstation down below, hopefully in shade, first of all. And then you're also being able to stand up a little bit, give your knees a rest, while also be able to cut sections perfectly. I have 2 stacks here, one where I just cut, which is going to be my starter row, and the other area is going to be not waste. This is going to be just placed on the opposite side of that row eventually, and then we'll cut off any of the excess as needed.
This basically just gives you a good representation on all the waste that we cut previously on that opposite side can now be added to this section in most parameters, because not every piece of waste will be able to be used at this location, but the vast majority of your waste will be. In terms of the shingle itself, the really nice thing about these shingles is this Owen Corning's Sure Nail system. It's the area specifically where I'm nailing, and it's basically just a high strength fabric that provides added nail pull through resistance, nail blowout resistance, and delamination resistance as well, which is all very important things when considering a quality asphalt roof. You never want your nails to line up perfectly with the seam or very close to the seams, and I definitely did that on a number of these shorter pieces, which I did come back and fix once I actually realized the error. And if I was able to catch it ahead of time, I would just take out that piece and replace it with a brand new one. But if I didn't catch it ahead of time, you can always apply a heavy bead of roofing sealant, and that will suffice for added protection. And speaking of nails, these roofing nails that I'm using on this project are very short because I want to make sure that there's no visible penetrations that you can see when you're underneath the carport and looking straight up at the plywood. Now, if this was a roof on your home and everything is fully drywalled, you're never going to see those penetrations. But in this application, I want a pristine look of this carport, and that's why we went with a very short nail. You just have to think about that ahead of time, and I did pick up these ones on Amazon because short roofing nails like these are generally not sold at your local box store. This was the very first time I installed this type of roofing shingle, but after doing a number of rows, I came to a distinct understanding of how to install it properly in terms of the style itself.
That's what you really want, is you want to try and line up the recessed with the raised. So these are recessed, raised, raised, recessed. So I do try and line those up so at least they look a little bit better.
I pay attention to the recessed and the raised, whether it's the full sheets that I'm installing or on the opposite side of the carport where I'm installing the excess cutoff from the previous side. Another nice item to discuss at this point is that you generally don't want to have any piece that's smaller than 6.5 inches. And that's why in some cases I decided to remove a small piece off of one side and then replace it with a larger piece, so it's not a minuscule 2-inch piece, it's a much more sizable piece at this end, which is going to be more durable in the long run.
There's a few things I learned through the process of doing this. Is number one, make sure you're stacking all these according so it doesn't actually stick to the underlayment. Make sure that the asphalt shingle exteriorly is actually laid down, and then when you're ready, then you can finally flip it over and install that. Otherwise it just gets uber sticky, especially on hot days like today. And go to the next piece.
As we install the last few runs of our asphalt shingles, we quickly realized whether or not our roof was perfectly square, or if those chalk lines came in handy, because on one side you may have 1 inch left of space, and on the other side you could have 3 inches left of space. That would not be good in terms of installing shingles, but in this application we were approximately about a ½ inch off from one side to the other, which means we were easily able to accommodate that difference with the shingle installation itself. A few items for full transparency and honesty is, with all the shingle overhang like this, it was much easier to install in terms of not having to cut every single one perfectly, but I personally don't know if this saved me time in the long run, because it definitely took up some time and energy to get this perfectly straight while cutting on the edge of the roof, and it's also not the safest way of doing it as well. So in the future, I'll most likely just cut each piece individually while I'm installing it, and not even have to worry about doing this at the tail end of the project. In terms of flashing at our ridge, after I cut off all the excess at the very top point, I did realize that the metal flashing that we had for this project was not going to be able to accommodate where the nails were striking at this location. Therefore, I installed one final row of asphalt shingles since we had enough on hand. And once I had that final row of asphalt shingles installed and all the excess cut off, I then proceed to installing our metal trim. And if you don't like this overall look, then you don't have to do this final row of shingles. We did because we had this material on site and on hand, but on your project, you could always use a larger piece of metal trim versus installing one final small row of asphalt shingles. I'll make sure I have a link in the description box below for the trim that I'm using here, but I'll also have a link for a more substantial piece of trim that can be used in lieu of this product. I cut the top side at a 90-degree angle with my snips and just bend that corner all the way over so it has a nice true square end. Once I have that, I bring it up to the roof and apply a very heavy bead of Henry's sealant in the corner, as well as a continuous bead along the top side of the trim. That sealant side is placed on the top of our shingles, pressed down, and then once I like the positioning, I then grab my metal connection framing nailer once again and nail off as needed across the entire length of this metal trim. Once I have one 10-foot long stretch completed, I then go to the opposite side and do essentially the same exact thing. Once both sides are installed, a middle portion of trim is applied, and once nailed down, we could apply a small dollop of sealant on every single fastener. I've seen plenty of pros do it this way and it seems to always work, but if there are leaks in the future, I can always come back around and instead of nails, I can install metal roofing screws that come with a gasket pre-installed, which will seal tightly and nicely.
Now with our gutter system, you could go with a vinyl or a metal version. However, because of the thickness difference between the two, with the trim that we've installed, you can only use this metal one. The vinyl one's too thick, and if you did want to use that, you could, but you would have to use some type of different drip edge. Just keep that in mind. We're gonna be going with this metal one because we're gonna be able to prop this right behind our flashing so we have proper layering between our asphalt roof, our flashing, and then our gutter.
As a reference point, this D metal is what we use at the very bottom of our carport, but a more preferred version would have been this starter strip. I don't know why my local specialty roofing supplier told me otherwise, but you live and you learn, and now I can advise you on how to do it properly and learn from my personal mishaps. Since we are going with the metal gutter system, we are going to be installing an outlet. And the nice thing about this system is that you can use the physical gutter system and just drill exactly where you need your hole to be placed. Once our 2.5-inch diameter hole is drilled out, I then apply a heavy bead of sealant across the entire perimeter of the outlet and squeeze that into position. Once that's snugly down, I then grab my end cap, apply another heavy bead of sealant at this location, and once positioned correctly, you then crimp it down on all sides. Now, I don't have crimper, and apparently there are crimpers specifically designed for metal gutter systems like this, and channel locks seem to do just fine in a pinch. Gotta love the occasional dad joke when you're a dad. Once crimped, I do apply another heavy bead of sealant on the back side as well as around the rim of our outlet. Once dry, it's now time for gutter hangers, and these are being placed on both ends as well as every 2 feet on center. That means for a 24-foot long stretch, I have 13 of them. At the end of the 10-foot run, I take my grinder with a diamond cutting wheel and just cut off 4 to 6 inches on the very top portion of this section. More on why we're doing this when we start trying to seam up 2 10-foot long pieces together at the same time, but till then, let's get this first section installed. As noted earlier, we are using this metal gutter system so we can get that back lip behind our drip edge flashing. That's important, especially if we don't want our gutter system to leak over time. As for connecting 2 gutter stretches together, I'm applying numerous beads of the sealant at this location where I cut off that edge, and then I slide our second piece of gutter right through that sealant all the way up to where it butts up against the edge of the first one. I make sure the back lip is in the correct position, and once that's done, I secure that gutter and turn my focus to the front lip. I pre-drill a couple small holes at this location and then secure it nicely with some screws that are specifically designed for metal gutters. I add 1 final bead of sealant, and once smoothed out, I can move on to the next section. My main focus for this installation is to guarantee that that back edge of our gutter is behind our roof flashing, but I do understand that in good practice we have a 1/4 inch of downward slope for every 10 feet of gutter length. We don't have that much slope to work with, but I am mindful that we have one side a little bit higher than the other. With our final piece of gutter, it does have to be cut down to size, which my grinder makes quick work of, but just remember that that edge is going to be a slightly rough. However, it's going to be hidden because it's going to be on the opposite side of the gutter that we're sliding it into. Once our final piece of gutter is installed, we can move on to the downspout. Now with the downspout, they do have a metal version, but I find that the vinyl version not only looks better, but it's also way easier to cut and install and less prone to dripping. These simple gutter clips are installed first, and once in place, I cut to fit our downspout and install a flex grate filter at the very bottom of our downspout to basically just filter out all large particulates and then drain properly away from the carport by attaching a perforated drain pipe that goes 20 feet long behind our shed. Once that's accounted for, I then attach a couple 45-degree elbows to our downspout and secure our downspout to our gutter up above. And after a few miscellaneous gutter screws are installed, I am proud to say that we are done. This carport by far is one of the largest undertakings I've ever personally taken on this channel, and as you can see, it turned out absolutely beautiful, so much so that you know it's always a good sign when every single neighbor on the block comes by on a walk and says how good it looks. But as promised, let's get to the overall cost of this entire project. Number 1, the footers. Between the concrete, the sonotubes, and the hardware, we came out to around $800. As for the framing and sheathing, that was a whopping $8,100. For the rentals, as far as the overall forklifts, as well as the track loader, we came out at about $1,900. And for the roofing material itself, along with the gutters, that was approximately $2,300. So a total of $13,100. And keep in mind that the vast majority of the cost for the framing was those 3 glue lamps. Those glue lamps were over $60 per lineal foot, which means that those 3 glue lamps alone was over $4,000. Quite expensive, but obviously the staple of this entire project. Just remember that if you do want to build this yourself, I do have detailed plans that are linked in the description box below. But no matter what, thank you so much for watching, and this is truly one beautiful, sexy beast of a carport. Oh yeah,